More than 3 years have passed since Vladimir Putin launched what he cynically called a special military operation against Ukraine. At the very beginning, Kremlin propaganda painted a picture of swift triumph. Western analysts even speculated that Kyiv might collapse within days. Russian state television broadcast images of convoys stretching for miles, while officials boast about the inevitability of denazification and demilitarization. But reality unfolded very differently. Today, after years of bloodshed, Russia has managed to seize less than 1% of Ukrainian territory, a fragment, a sliver, a mere 0.97% of the country's landmass. For this minuscule gain, Putin has set his own country ablaze. The cost is staggering. Over 1 million Russian soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in action. Each patch of captured soil came at the price of rivers of blood. When measured, the math is almost absurd. More than 430 soldiers lost for every single square mile of land taken since late 2022. Never in modern military history has such a catastrophic imbalance been recorded. Such monumental losses for such a trivial reward. And yet, inside the Kremlin, the illusion persists. Officials speak of breakthroughs, of glorious advances, of inevitable victory. In reality, the map barely changes. Ukraine holds, Ukraine resists, and Ukraine adapts. Each day the Russian army spends grinding forward by meters, not miles, is another day its economy, its people, and its future are consumed in the fire of a war that was never winnable. When Putin ordered the invasion in February 2022, the Kremlin's entire strategy was built on the fantasy of a lightning war. Russian generals expected to overwhelm Ukraine in a matter of days. The armored columns driving toward Kyiv were supposed to parade to the capital within a week. Elite airborne troops, dropped near Hostomel, were meant to seize airports and open the gates for a rapid advance. Moscow calculated that Zelensky's government would flee, NATO would hesitate, and the Ukrainian people would simply surrender. But those calculations collapsed almost instantly. The columns were ambushed, the airborne units surrounded, and instead of surrendering, Ukrainians fought with ferocity that stunned the world. Kyiv did not fall in 3 days. Instead, Russia's grand offensive stalled before it even reached the city center. What was meant to be a quick decapitation strike became a drawn-out war of survival, one that Russia was utterly unprepared to sustain. By the end of 2022, the Kremlin was forced to abandon its dream of blitzkrieg. The war turned into a grinding war of attrition, where every meter of land required months of bloodshed. Russian strategy devolved into hurling wave after wave of troops into fortified Ukrainian positions, often without proper equipment, training, or coordination. Entire battalions were thrown into battles like Bakhmut and Avdiivka, fighting not for strategic gain, but for propaganda victories that could be shown on Russian television. The cost of this strategy was staggering. Independent estimates, combined with Ukrainian figures, suggest that Russia has lost well over 1 million men, killed, wounded, or permanently disabled. For every kilometer advanced, thousands of bodies were left behind. The ratio of loss to gain is historically unprecedented. More than 430 soldiers for every square mile of Ukrainian land captured since late 2022. And what has Russia gained in return? A handful of shattered towns, reduced to rubble, with no real economic or strategic value. Cities like Mariinka and Soledar exist only as ruins, their populations gone, their infrastructure obliterated. Russia controls them on a map, but in reality, they are wastelands that drain Moscow's resources rather than strengthen its position. Economically, the war has become a slow-motion suicide. Sanctions have cut Russia off from modern technology, oil revenues have shrunk, and the country is forced to pour trillions of rubles into a war machine that consumes everything and gives nothing back. Moscow continues to burn through tanks, artillery, and aircraft faster than it can replace them. Even its human capital, young men, engineers, doctors, workers, is being lost to front or driven abroad by fear of mobilization. And yet, despite all this destruction, Putin insists on pushing forward. He sells the war to his people as a sacred mission, as though losing generations of Russians is justified for seizing a fraction of Donetsk fields or a broken town near the Dnipro. In the name of victory, he is sacrificing Russia itself. As the war dragged on, it became clear Ukraine was not the only victim. Russia itself began to crumble under the weight of Putin's obsession. What was supposed to be a swift victory turned into a national catastrophe, devouring the very foundations of Russian society. Mobilization and the human cost. In 2022, the Kremlin announced its first wave of partial mobilization. Hundreds of thousands of men were swept from their homes, offices, and universities, shoved into training camps, and sent to front with minimal preparation. Many were handed rusted rifles, outdated body armor, and helmets from the Soviet era. Videos leaked online showed soldiers sleeping in tents without proper heating, eating rotten food, and begging their families to send basic medical supplies. The human toll was brutal. Families lost fathers, brothers, and sons by the thousands. Some men fled abroad, creating one of the largest waves of emigration in modern Russian history. Others went into hiding, terrified of conscription, officers knocking on their doors. Small towns and villages were hollowed out, their male populations drained for the front lines. Repression and fear. At home, dissent was crushed with iron fists. Any protest against the war was met with immediate arrests. Independent media was silenced, journalists branded as foreign agents, and truth itself became a crime. Even grieving mothers who dared to question why their sons had died in Ukraine were threatened, harassed, or ignored. The Kremlin revived the machinery of fear. Ordinary Russians lived under constant surveillance, knowing that one careless word could lead to prison. Neighbors reported on each other. Teachers were forced to indoctrinate children with war propaganda. The war was no longer just fought in Ukraine. It seeped into every Russian household, every classroom, every workplace. Economic decay. Meanwhile, the economy cracked under the strain. Sanctions cut Russia off from Western technology, forcing industries to scramble for inferior substitutes. The once proud aviation industry collapsed as aircraft maintenance became impossible without foreign parts. Car factories shut down. Supermarket shelves emptied of everyday goods. Inflation soared. Ordinary people saw their savings evaporate, their wages stagnate, and prices for food and utilities skyrocket. Moscow continued to pour billions into the war machine, even as hospitals lacked medicine and schools crumbled from neglect. It was as if the Kremlin had decided that every ruble, every drop of national wealth, must be fed into the furnace of war. A society in decline. The consequences were visible everywhere. Skilled professionals, IT experts, doctors, engineers, fled in droves, unwilling to live under oppression or die in a pointless war. Those who remained faced a bleak future of poverty, censorship, and militarization. Russia, once eager to present itself as a modern power, began to resemble a besieged fortress, inward-looking, paranoid, and bleeding from within. Putin claimed he was fighting for Russia's greatness. But in reality, he was burning Russia to the ground for the sake of a tiny strip of foreign land. The Kremlin's obsession with conquest was hollowing out its own nation faster than any enemy ever could. As the war dragged into its third year, Russia found itself in a position it had not faced since the darkest days of the Cold War, near total isolation. Sanctions and economic walls. The Western sanctions regime tightened like a noose. Banks were cut off from the global SWIFT system, crippling Russia's ability to trade freely. Energy exports, once the lifeblood of the Kremlin's economy, faced caps, embargoes, and shrinking demand. Europe, once Moscow's biggest customer, rewired its energy networks almost overnight, turning to Norway, the Middle East, and the U.S. for gas and oil. Billions of rubles that had once flowed into Russia's treasury evaporated. Technology sanctions were even more devastating. Without access to Western microchips, semiconductors, and advanced machinery, Russian industries began to break down. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of spare parts. Factories cannibalized old equipment to keep production lines barely alive. Even the defense industry, the crown jewel of Moscow's power, struggled to replace the tanks, missiles, and drones being lost daily on the battlefield. The illusion of allies. At first, the Kremlin boasted that it still had true friends, China, India, Iran. But these friends proved pragmatic rather than loyal. Beijing bought discounted Russian oil but refused to risk secondary sanctions by supplying advanced weapons. India enjoyed cheap fuel, but strengthened ties with the West at the same time. Iran sold drones and ammunition, but in return extracted heavy political concessions, treating Moscow less like a partner and more like a desperate client. Even in Central Asia, long considered Russia's backyard, cracks appeared. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and others quietly distanced themselves, fearful of sharing Russia's fate. One by one, doors closed. Where once the Kremlin commanded influence, now it begged for scraps. Diplomatic pariah. International forums became a stage of humiliation. Russian officials were shunned at summits. Their speeches met with silence or walkouts. United Nations votes repeatedly condemned Moscow's aggression, with only a handful of dictatorships standing by its side. Putin, once eager to appear at global gatherings, was reduced to addressing tightly controlled meetings in friendly capitals, his circle of partners shrinking year after year. Travel itself became symbolic of Russia's isolation. Western airspace was closed to Russian planes. Russian passports, once allowing travel across Europe and beyond, now carried suspicion. Ordinary citizens discovered they were unwelcome abroad, punished not just by their own government, but by the image of a country waging war against the world order, the new Iron Curtain. Step by step, Russia built for itself a new Iron Curtain. But unlike the Cold War, when the Soviet Union projected ideological power across half the globe, today's Russia stands largely alone, feared but not respected, hated but not admired. Its empire is nothing more than a handful of puppet states and fragile partnerships with regimes that use Moscow for their own gain. Putin's dream of restoring Russia's greatness has instead made it a pariah, a nation burning its bridges abroad as surely as it burns its future home. History will not remember the number of speeches Putin gave, or the parades he staged in Moscow to glorify his war. History will remember the numbers that cannot be erased. Hundreds of thousands of dead, millions exiled, trillions of rubles burned away, and an entire nation pushed back decades in its development. And for what? Less than 1% of Ukraine's landmass. A fragment so small, it doesn't even appear clearly on a world map. A handful of ruined towns, empty villages, and bombed-out fields that hold no strategic value, no real victory, and no justification for the price Russia has already paid. The tragedy is that this war, sold as a path to greatness, has become an act of national self-destruction. Putin has not restored an empire. He has sacrificed Russia's future on the altar of his own pride. He has not expanded the nation's borders. He has shrunk its prospects, its economy, and its very soul. Every coffin returning home, every child growing up without a father, every family broken by mobilization tells the same story. This is not a war for glory. It is a war that burns Russia itself. One day, when the smoke clears, the Russian people will look back and ask the question their leaders cannot answer. Was a sliver of foreign land worth the price of an entire country's destruction? And the answer will be written in the ashes. No.